I was sitting in my truck, finishing paperwork after installing a commercial HVAC system in Phoenix, Arizona, when I noticed a woman in designer athletic wear marching toward me with the kind of purposeful stride that meant trouble. She looked about 50, with highlighted blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, expensive sunglasses perched on her head, and the sort of pinched expression that suggested she'd spent years perfecting her disapproving glare. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You cannot park that eyesore here." I glanced at my white Ford F-350 with the company logo on the side. It was clean, professional, and parked legally on a public street in front of a house I just finished working on. The truck had my business name, Ingram Climate Solutions, painted in blue letters along with my contact information. Nothing offensive, nothing illegal. "I'm finishing up a job," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'll be gone in about 10 minutes. That's not the point." She crossed her arms, her manicured nails tapping against her forearm. "Commercial vehicles are not allowed in Sunrise Valley Estates. It's in our HOA regulations, Section 12, Paragraph 4. I looked up from my clipboard. "Madam, I'm not parked in Sunrise Valley Estates. This is Maple Street." "It's a public road." Her face flushed slightly. "The HOA boundaries extend to include the streets surrounding our community. You're in violation of our aesthetic guidelines." I set down my clipboard and took a deep breath. I'd dealt with difficult people before in my line of work, but something about her attitude was already grating on my nerves. "Let me be clear. I'm parked on a public street, maintained by the city of Phoenix, doing legitimate business. Your HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over public roads." "I'm Sharon Whitmore, president of the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA board," she announced, as if that title carried the weight of actual legal authority. "And I'm telling you that you need to move this vehicle immediately, or I'll have it towed." I climbed out of my truck, standing at my full 6'2" height. I wasn't trying to intimidate her, but I also wasn't about to be pushed around. "Miss Whitmore, you can call whoever you want, but this is a public street. I have every right to be here. I'm working and I'm leaving soon anyway." "What's your name?" she demanded, pulling out her phone. "Oliver Ingram," I said. "That's my company on the side of the truck." She typed something into her phone, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm documenting this. We have strict rules about commercial vehicles, work trucks, and the like. They decrease property values and make the neighborhood look low class." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd built my HVAC business from the ground up over the past 8 years. I employed 12 people, paid my taxes, and provided essential services to the Phoenix metropolitan area. There was nothing low class about honest work, and her attitude was exactly the kind of entitled nonsense that made people hate HOAs. "You do what you need to do," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'll be here for another few minutes, then I'm gone." She took several photos of my truck, muttering under her breath about reporting me to the proper authorities. I ignored her, finished my paperwork, and drove away. I figured that would be the end of it. Some HOA president had gotten herself worked up over nothing, wasted both our time, and life would go on. I was wrong. 3 days later, I got a certified letter in the mail. The return address showed it was from the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA. I opened it, curious about what possible reason they'd have to contact me. I didn't live in their neighborhood, didn't own property there, and had only been on their adjacent public street for maybe 30 minutes total. The letter was 2 pages long, printed on expensive letterhead, and full of the kind of bureaucratic language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. The gist of it was this: I was being formally notified that commercial vehicles were banned from the Sunrise Valley Estates community and surrounding areas. I was being fined $250 for my first violation, and if I was seen parking my unsightly work vehicle in their area again, the fines would increase to $500, then $1,000 for subsequent violations. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rise a little higher. They were trying to fine me for parking on a public street. They were claiming jurisdiction over city property. And they apparently thought I'd just roll over and pay them money for doing absolutely nothing wrong. I called my lawyer, David Chen, who I'd worked with when incorporating my business. He listened to my explanation, asked me to scan and email him the letter, and called me back an hour later. "Oliver, this is complete nonsense," David said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. "They have no legal authority over public streets. Zero. They can't fine you, they can't tow you, and they certainly can't enforce any kind of ban on where you park your commercial vehicle as long as you're following city ordinances." "So what do?" I asked. "Ignore it," David said. "Don't pay the fine. Don't respond to their letter. They're hoping you don't know your rights and that you'll just comply. If they escalate, let me know, but honestly, this will probably go away once they realize they can't actually enforce any of this." I took his advice and threw the letter in my recycling bin, but I couldn't quite let it go. The whole situation bothered me. Sharon Whitmore and her HOA thought they could bully people into compliance, even when they had no legal standing. How many contractors, delivery drivers, or service workers had they harassed? How many people had paid fines they didn't actually owe because they didn't know any better? 2 weeks passed, and I found myself working on another job, this time installing a new air conditioning system for a family on Oak Drive, which was 1 street over from where I'd had my original encounter with Sharon. It was a legitimate job, good money, and I wasn't about to avoid an entire area of Phoenix just because some HOA president had a power trip. I parked my truck on Oak Drive, which was also a public street, and started unloading equipment. The installation would take most of the day, so my truck would be there for several hours. About an hour into the job, I heard raised voices outside. I walked to the front of the house and saw Sharon Whitmore standing next to my truck, talking on her phone while gesturing angrily. "Yes, I need a tow truck immediately," she was saying. "There's an unauthorized commercial vehicle in violation of our community standards." I walked down the driveway. "Miss Whitmore, we've been through this. This is a public street." She held up one finger, telling me to wait while she finished her call. "Yes, Maple Street. No, wait, Oak Drive. Thank you." She hung up and turned to me with a satisfied expression. "Your truck is being towed. You were warned." "You're wasting everyone's time," I said. "The tow company isn't going to tow a legally parked vehicle from a public street just because you ask them to. We have a contract with Davidson Towing," she said. "They know our policies." 20 minutes later, a tow truck pulled up. The driver, a guy in his 40s with a weathered face, climbed out and walked over to my F-350. He looked at it, looked at the street, then looked at Sharon. "What's the problem?" he asked. "This vehicle is in violation of our HOA regulations," Sharon said. "It needs to be removed immediately." The driver looked at me. "Is this your truck?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm doing HVAC work for the family in that house. I'm parked legally on a public street." He nodded slowly, then turned to Sharon. "Madam, I can't tow a legally parked vehicle from a city street." If he was blocking a driveway, parked in a fire lane, or in violation of posted restrictions, that would be different. But this is just a work truck parked normally. Sharon's face went red. "We have a contract with your company. You're supposed to enforce our community standards." "Our contract covers towing from private HOA property," the driver said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "This ain't. Isn't HOA property. This is a city street. I'm not towing this truck. He got back in his tow truck and drove away, leaving Sharon sputtering with indignation. She turned to me, her eyes blazing. This isn't over. You're going to regret defying the HOA. I'm not defying anyone, I said, keeping my tone calm even though I was getting seriously annoyed. I'm doing my job. You need to stop harassing me and let me work. She stormed off, and I went back to installing the air conditioning system. The homeowners, a nice couple in their 30s named Greg and Linda Martinez, apologized profusely for the disruption. Sharon is intense, Linda said diplomatically. She takes the HOA stuff really seriously. Too seriously, Greg added. We're not even in Sunrise Valley Estates. We're just next to it, but she acts like she runs the whole zip code. That comment stuck with me. After I finished the job and was packing up my tools, I did some research on my phone. Oak Drive, like Maple Street, was not part of the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA. The HOA boundaries were clearly defined in the county records, and they included only the streets within the actual gated community. All the surrounding streets were public roads maintained by the city and not subject to any HOA governance. Sharon Whitmore knew this, or she should have known it. She was either deliberately lying about her authority, or she was so drunk on her tiny amount of power that she'd convinced herself her jurisdiction extended beyond its legal limits. I got another letter 4 days later. This one informed me that I now owed $550 in fines for 2 violations, and that if I didn't pay within 14 days, the HOA would pursue legal action against me. They included a payment form and instructions for sending a check or money order. I called David again. They're escalating, I said, and forwarded him the new letter. He called me back within the hour, and this time he sounded more serious. Oliver, they're threatening legal action. They won't win, but they might actually file something, which means we'd have to respond. Let me draft a cease and desist letter. We'll make it clear that they have no authority over your parking on public streets, and that if they continue this harassment, you'll pursue legal remedies against them. What kind of legal remedies? I asked. Harassment, potentially a civil rights violation if they're interfering with your ability to conduct business, David said. Look, I don't think it'll come to that. Most HOAs back down once they get a letter from an attorney explaining actual law to them, but we need to establish a paper trail. David sent the cease and desist letter via certified mail. In it, he laid out the facts. I was parking on public streets. The HOA had no jurisdiction over those streets. Their fines were illegitimate, and any further attempts to restrict my legal business activities or collect false fines would result in legal action. It was professional, factual, and firm. The response came not from the HOA's lawyer, but from Sharon Whitmore herself. She sent an email to my business address, which she'd gotten from my website. The email was CC'd to the entire Sunrise Valley Estates HOA board and was full of accusations. She claimed I was deliberately antagonizing the community, that I was parking my offensive commercial vehicle in their area specifically to spite them, and that my behavior was threatening and intimidating. None of it was true. I was working in the area because I had clients there. Phoenix was my service area, and I wasn't going to turn down legitimate jobs just because they happened to be near an HOA with a delusional president. But the email gave me an idea. If Sharon wanted to escalate this, I could fight back in a different way. I started documenting everything. I took photos of where I parked, noting the street signs showing these were public roads. I kept copies of all correspondence. I started carrying a small notebook where I wrote down dates, times, and details of any interactions with Sharon or other HOA representatives. I also talked to other contractors who worked in the area. I stopped by a plumbing supply store in Phoenix and chatted with some of the regular customers. The stories I heard were infuriating. Multiple contractors had been harassed by Sharon and the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA. Some had paid the fines just to avoid the hassle. Others had stopped working in that area entirely because dealing with the HOA wasn't worth the stress. One electrician, a guy named Tom who'd been in business for 20 years, told me he'd paid almost $800 in bogus fines over the past year. "I didn't know I could fight it," he said. "I thought maybe they did have some kind of authority." By the time I realized they were scamming me, I'd already paid. I felt a surge of anger on his behalf. This was more than just an annoying HOA president. This was systematic harassment and what amounted to theft. They were collecting money from people who didn't owe them anything, using intimidation and official-looking letters to trick people into paying. I reached out to Tom and 2 other contractors who'd had similar experiences. I connected them with David Chen, who agreed to look into whether there was grounds for a class action suit or some kind of collective legal response. In the meantime, I made a decision. I wasn't going to hide from the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA. If I had work in that area, I'd take it, and I'd park wherever it was legal and convenient. The next job I got was from a referral. A woman named Zara Anderson called my office, saying she needed her entire HVAC system replaced in her house in Phoenix. When she gave me her address, I realized it was on Pine Court, directly adjacent to Sunrise Valley Estates. In fact, her house backed up to the HOA community's fence line. "Are you familiar with the HOA next door?" I asked carefully. "Unfortunately, yes," Zara said, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. "They've been a nightmare. I'm not part of their HOA, but they keep trying to tell me what I can and can't do with my own property." "Why do you ask?" I explained my situation with Sharon Whitmore. Zara laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "That's exactly the kind of thing Sharon does. She's been sending me letters about my fence, my landscaping, my choice of mailbox. I finally had to get a lawyer to send her a cease and desist. She backed off for a few months, but she's starting up again." "I'd be happy to give you a quote on your HVAC system," I said. "And just so you know, I'll be parking on the street. If Sharon has a problem with it, that's her issue, not mine." Zara hired me for the job. It was a big project, a full system replacement that would take 3 days of work. I scheduled it for the following week and made sure I had all my documentation ready. I had a feeling Sharon would make an appearance. I was right. On the first day of the job, I'd been working for maybe 2 hours when Sharon showed up, this time with 2 other people. One was a man in his 60s wearing a polo shirt with HOA board member embroidered on it. The other was a younger woman, maybe in her 40s, carrying a tablet. "Mr. Ingram," Sharon said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "We need to discuss your continued violations of our community standards." "There's nothing to discuss," I said. "I was on a ladder, working on disconnecting the old outdoor unit, and I didn't bother climbing down. I'm working. I'm parked legally. You have no authority here." The man stepped forward. "I'm Richard Patterson, Vice President of the Sunrise Valley Estates Board. We've been more than patient with you, but you're forcing our hand. We're prepared to take this to court." I climbed down from the ladder and faced them. "You're welcome to do that. I've already consulted with my attorney, and I'm confident that any judge will tell you exactly what I've been telling you. You don't have jurisdiction over public streets." The younger woman spoke up. "We've consulted with our attorney as well, and she believes we have a strong case based on community standards and property value protection. Then I guess we'll see what a judge says, I replied. In the meantime, I have work to do. Unless you're planning to pay for the hours you're costing me, I need you to leave so I can finish this job. Sharon's face flushed with anger. You're going to regret this attitude. We have ways of dealing with people who refuse to cooperate. That sounded like a threat, and I pulled out my phone. I'm going to start recording this conversation. Could you repeat what you just said about having ways of dealing with people? All three of them immediately stepped back. Richard held up his hands. There's no need for that. We're just trying to resolve this amicably. Then amicably leave me alone to do my job, I said, keeping my phone out and camera facing them. They left, but I could see Sharon on her phone as they walked away, clearly calling someone. I went back to work, but I was on edge for the rest of the day, half expecting the police to show up or some other escalation. Nothing happened that day, but when I arrived the next morning to continue the job, I found a bright orange sticker on my truck's driver's side window. It looked official, with the Sunrise Valley Estates logo and text that read, "Violation Notice. This vehicle is in violation of community regulations and is subject to immediate towing and impound. Contact the HOA office immediately to resolve this matter." I peeled the sticker off, balled it up, and threw it in my truck. Then I took photos of the residue it left on my window, documenting everything. This was vandalism, technically, since they'd stuck something on my vehicle without permission. It was minor, but it was part of the pattern of harassment. Zara came out of her house as I was taking the photos. "They put that on your truck?" "Yeah," I said. "This morning." She shook her head in disgust. "I'm so tired of their behavior. They act like they own the entire neighborhood. Last month, they tried to tell me I couldn't have my sister's car parked in my driveway overnight because it was unsightly. It's my driveway, my property. They have no say in it." "Have you ever thought about pushing back more formally?" I asked. "Like filing complaints with the city or getting other non-HOA residents together?" Zara's eyes lit up. "Actually, a few of us have talked about it. There are maybe a dozen houses around the HOA that aren't part of it, and Sharon has harassed most of us at one point or another. We just haven't organized anything official. An idea was forming in my head. What if we did? What if we documented all the harassment, all the bogus fines, all the times they've overstepped their authority? We could file complaints with the city, maybe even pursue legal action if there's enough evidence of a pattern." "I'd be interested," Zara said. "Let me reach out to some of the other neighbors. Maybe we could have a meeting." Over the next few days, as I finished Zara's HVAC installation, she coordinated with other nearby residents. It turned out that Sharon and the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA had been terrorizing the neighborhood for years. The list of complaints was extensive. Bogus fines, harassment about property maintenance, attempts to restrict parking on public streets, threatening letters, and even cases where the HOA had allegedly reported residents to the city for made-up code violations. We scheduled a meeting at Zara's house on a Saturday evening. 11 people showed up, including me and 2 other contractors who'd been harassed. Everyone had stories, and everyone was fed up. A retired teacher named Margaret Santos had been fighting with the HOA for 3 years over a tree in her front yard. The HOA claimed the tree was unsightly and demanded she remove it. The tree was on Margaret's property. She wasn't part of the HOA, and she loved that tree. She'd spent thousands of dollars on legal fees defending her right to keep it. A young couple, Dan and Michelle Cooper, had been fined repeatedly for parking their work vehicles in their own driveway. Dan was a landscaper, and Michelle was a home healthcare nurse who drove a company car. Neither vehicle was particularly large or unsightly, but Sharon had declared them violations of community aesthetics. The stories went on and on. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. We'd compile all our documentation, file formal complaints with the city of Phoenix, and consult with attorneys about possible civil action. We also decided to start attending HOA board meetings. The meetings were technically open to the public, even for non-members, and we wanted to make our presence known. The next Sunrise Valley Estates HOA board meeting was on a Tuesday evening at 7. 8 of us showed up, filing into the community center conference room where the meeting was held. The look on Sharon Whitmore's face when we walked in was priceless. She clearly hadn't expected this. "Excuse me," she said as we took seats in the back row. "This meeting is for residents of Sunrise Valley Estates only." "Actually," Margaret Santos said, pulling out a printed copy of Arizona HOA law, "HOA board meetings in Arizona are required to be open to all homeowners in the association. Additionally, there's no restriction on members of the public observing as long as we don't disrupt the meeting." Sharon looked flustered. She conferred briefly with Richard Patterson and the other board members, then reluctantly continued with the meeting. We sat quietly, taking notes and recording audio on our phones as they went through their agenda. Most of it was mundane, stuff about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance. But then they got to enforcement actions. Sharon pulled up a list on her laptop. "We have several outstanding violations that need to be addressed. First, there's continued illegal parking of commercial vehicles in and around the community." "Point of order," I said, raising my hand. Sharon's eyes narrowed. "This is not a public comment period." "I understand," I said, standing up anyway. "But you're discussing actions that directly affect me and several others in this room. You've been issuing fines and violations to people who aren't part of your HOA and for parking on public streets where you have no jurisdiction. That's harassment, and it's potentially illegal." The room went silent. The dozen or so actual HOA residents who were attending the meeting looked confused, glancing between Sharon and our group. Richard Patterson stood up. "Mr. Ingram, you've been repeatedly violating our community standards. We have the right to protect our property values and maintain the aesthetic quality of our neighborhood. You have the right to enforce rules within your HOA boundaries," I countered. "You don't have the right to fine people who aren't members of your HOA. You don't have jurisdiction over public streets, and you definitely don't have the right to harass contractors and residents who are conducting lawful business and living their lives." One of the actual HOA residents, an older man I didn't recognize, spoke up. "Wait, are we fining people who aren't even in the HOA?" Sharon tried to regain control. "We're protecting the community from commercial vehicles and activities that decrease property values." "You're collecting money from people who don't owe you anything," Zara Anderson interrupted, standing up beside me. "I've received 6 violation notices in the past year for things on my own property. I'm not part of your HOA. You have no authority over my house, my yard, or my choices. None." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Several actual HOA residents started asking questions, demanding to know if the board had been issuing fines outside their jurisdiction. Sharon tried to shut down the discussion, but it was too late. The cat was out of the bag. We left the meeting after about an hour, feeling like we'd accomplished something. We'd planted seeds of doubt among the actual HOA members, and we'd made it clear that we weren't going to be pushed around anymore. 2 days later, I got a call from a reporter at the Arizona Republic, Phoenix's major newspaper. Someone had tipped them off about the HOA dispute, and they wanted to interview me. I agreed and spent an hour on the phone explaining the situation. The reporter was fascinated, especially when I mentioned the other contractors who'd been scammed into paying bogus fines. The article came out the following Sunday, and it was front-page news in the local section. The headline read, "Phoenix HOA accused of harassing non-members, collecting illegal fines." The article detailed my story, included quotes from Zara and several other neighbors, and featured a response from Sharon Whitmore that was defensive and tone-deaf. She insisted the HOA had the right to enforce standards in surrounding areas to protect property values, which just made her sound more unreasonable. The article lit a fire under the city. Within a week, the Phoenix City Attorney's Office announced they were investigating the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA for potential violations of Arizona HOA law and harassment of residents. The state attorney general's office also got involved, since collecting money under false pretenses could potentially be considered fraud. Sharon and the HOA board doubled down. They hired a lawyer and issued a statement claiming that all their actions were within their legal rights and that they were being unfairly targeted. But the damage was done. Current HOA members started asking questions and demanding audits of where fine money had been going. Several contractors came forward with their own stories of harassment and bogus fines. My lawyer, David Chen, filed a civil suit on behalf of me and 4 other contractors, seeking damages for harassment, defamation, and interference with business operations. We also demanded that the HOA return all money collected from people who weren't HOA members and issue formal apologies. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes do, but the pressure on the HOA kept building. A group of actual Sunrise Valley Estates residents started a petition to remove Sharon Whitmore from the board. Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly, Sharon's face was on the evening news, representing everything people hated about overzealous HOAs. Through all of this, I kept working. I had a business to run, and I wasn't going to let Sharon's crusade interfere with my livelihood. I continued taking jobs throughout Phoenix, including in areas adjacent to Sunrise Valley Estates. I parked wherever it was legal and convenient. And every time I did, I documented it with photos and notes, building my case. About 3 months after the newspaper article came out, I got a call from David. "Oliver, you're going to want to hear this. The HOA's lawyer reached out. They want to settle." "What are their terms?" I asked. "Full refund of all fines collected from non-members, a formal written apology, a promise to cease all enforcement actions outside their jurisdiction, and $25,000 split between you and the other plaintiffs for damages and legal fees." I thought about it. $25,000 split 5 ways wasn't life-changing money, but it wasn't nothing either. More importantly, it was an admission that they'd been wrong. "What about Sharon?" "The HOA membership voted her out last week," David said. "She's no longer on the board. Richard Patterson is the new president, and he's apparently trying to clean up the mess she left." "I want one more thing," I said. "I want a written agreement that states I and any other contractor or service provider can park on any public street in the area without any interference, harassment, or bogus violation notices from the HOA. I want it in writing, signed by their lawyer and the new board president." David laughed. "I'll ask for it. Given how this has gone, I think they'll agree to just about anything to make this go away." He was right. 2 weeks later, I had a settlement agreement that included everything I'd asked for. The HOA issued a public apology, printed in the Arizona Republic, admitting they'd overstepped their authority and promising to reform their practices. They refunded over $15,000 in bogus fines to various contractors and residents. And I got a signed, notarized document guaranteeing my right to park and work in the area without interference. But the story didn't end there. About a month after the settlement, I got a call from Tom, the electrician who'd been one of the first contractors I'd talked to about the HOA harassment. "Oliver, you need to see this. Check your email." I opened my email and found a forwarded message. It was from someone who'd been on the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA board during Sharon's tenure. The email included attachments, scanned documents showing that Sharon and Richard Patterson had been pocketing a portion of the fine money they'd collected. It wasn't a huge amount, maybe a few $1,000s total, but it was theft. They'd been using a separate bank account, not part of the HOA's official finances, to collect and distribute the bogus fines. I immediately forwarded the email to David and to the city attorney's office. Within days, both Sharon and Richard were under criminal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The HOA hired an outside auditor to review all their finances, and the full extent of the scheme became clear. Over 3 years, they'd collected more than $40,000 in bogus fines and fees from non-members. About $8,000 of that had been diverted to personal accounts. The criminal charges took months to wind through the system, but eventually, both Sharon Whitmore and Richard Patterson pleaded guilty to fraud and embezzlement charges. Sharon was sentenced to 18 months in prison, though she'd likely serve less with good behavior. Richard got 12 months and a hefty fine. Both were ordered to pay full restitution to everyone they'd scammed. The Sunrise Valley Estates HOA underwent a complete restructuring. They hired a professional management company, adopted new bylaws that included better oversight and transparency, and made a genuine effort to be better neighbors to the surrounding community. The new board president, a reasonable woman named Teresa Kim, even reached out to me personally to apologize for everything that had happened and to assure me that things would be different going forward. I accepted her apology, though I remained cautious. I'd seen firsthand how quickly power could corrupt, especially in the weird little fiefdoms that HOAs could become. But I appreciated the gesture, and I hoped they'd learned their lesson. As for me, the whole experience changed how I approached my business. I became an advocate for contractor rights, speaking at local business association meetings about dealing with difficult HOAs and knowing your legal rights. I helped other contractors who were facing similar harassment, connecting them with David Chen and sharing the documentation methods I'd developed. I also became something of a local minor celebrity in Phoenix's contractor community. People knew me as the guy who'd stood up to the HOA and won. I got more business because of it, as people specifically sought out my company because they appreciated that I wouldn't be pushed around by petty tyrants with clipboards and community standards guidelines. The whole ordeal taught me important lessons about standing up for yourself, knowing your rights, and not backing down when you're in the right. It would have been easier to just avoid that area, to park somewhere less convenient, to let Sharon have her way. But that would have been letting a bully win, and it would have meant that the next person she targeted would have to fight the same battle. I still drive my white Ford F350 with Ingram Climate Solutions painted on the side. I still park it wherever it's legal and convenient for the job I'm doing. And if I happen to have a job near Sunrise Valley Estates, I park right there on the public street, just like I have every right to do. The last time I was in that neighborhood, working on a repair job for one of the actual HOA residents, Teresa Kim came out to say hello. We had a pleasant conversation, and she mentioned that they'd updated their enforcement policies to make it clear that the HOA only had jurisdiction within its actual boundaries. "We were embarrassed by what happened," she admitted. Sharon convinced a lot of people that we had to be aggressive about protecting property values, and nobody really questioned whether we had the authority to do half the things we were doing. It was a wake-up call for the whole community. "I'm glad something good came out of it," I said. And I meant it. The situation had been stressful, time-consuming and frustrating, but it had resulted in real change. Not just for me, but for all the contractors and residents who'd been harassed by an out-of-control HOA that thought it was above the law. Zara Anderson and I became friends through the whole process. She ended up organizing a neighborhood watch group for the non-HOA residents around Sunrise Valley estates, not to watch for crime so much as to watch for HOA overreach. They kept an eye out for each other, shared information about any harassment or bogus fines, and had a direct line to the city attorney's office if issues arose. Margaret Santos finally won her battle to keep her tree, which was never really in doubt legally, but had caused her years of stress. She threw a party in her backyard under that tree once the settlement was finalized, and half the neighborhood came. It was a celebration not just of her victory, but of all our victories over petty bureaucratic tyranny. The contractors who'd been scammed got their money back, plus damages. Tom, the electrician, used his settlement money to upgrade his truck and equipment. He told me later that standing up to the HOA had given him confidence to be more assertive with difficult clients in general. As for the actual legal and criminal proceedings, they wrapped up about a year after my initial encounter with Sharon on Maple Street. It had been a long, exhausting process, but seeing real accountability felt good. Sharon and Richard both lost their reputations, their positions, and ultimately their freedom for a time. The message was clear. You can't just make up rules, collect money, and harass people because you think you have authority you don't actually possess. The broader HOA reform conversation in Arizona gained momentum from the case, too. State legislators started looking at HOA regulations more carefully, considering new laws that would provide better protections for both HOA members and non-members who might be affected by HOA overreach. I even testified before a state legislative committee about my experience, which was surreal but important. I learned a lot about the legal system through all of this. I learned that justice can be slow, but it can also be real if you're patient and persistent. I learned that documentation is everything, that having a good lawyer is worth every penny, and that standing up for your rights isn't just about you, it's about everyone who comes after you. My business continued to grow. The publicity from the case actually helped more than it hurt. People liked that I'd stood up to an HOA bully, and they trusted that I'd be straightforward and honest with them. I hired more technicians, bought another truck, and expanded my service area throughout the Phoenix metropolitan region. Every now and then, I drive past Sunrise Valley estates and remember that first encounter with Sharon Whitmore. It seemed like ancient history now, even though it had only been a year and a half. The neighborhood looked the same, neat houses with desert landscaping and well-maintained streets. But I knew the community behind those walls had changed, had learned hard lessons about governance and authority. I never did pay those original fines Sharon tried to collect from me. Not one penny. And I never backed down from parking wherever I needed to park to do my job. That was the whole point, really. The right to conduct legal business, to work hard, to make an honest living without being harassed by people who thought their perceived status gave them power they didn't legally have. David Chen sent me a final bill for his legal services, and it was substantial, though much of it was covered by the settlement. I paid it gladly. He'd done excellent work, and more than that, he'd believed in the case from the beginning. He'd seen it not just as defending one contractor's right to park on a public street, but as a broader stand against HOA overreach and abuse of authority. "You should be proud of what you accomplished," David told me when we met for a final wrap-up meeting at his office in downtown Phoenix. "A lot of people would have just paid the fine and moved on. You stood up for yourself and changed things for a lot of other people in the process." "I just didn't like being pushed around," I said, though I knew it was more than that. It was about principle, about fairness, about making sure that people with a little bit of power couldn't abuse it without consequences. Life moved on. Seasons changed, though in Phoenix that mostly meant it went from blazing hot to merely warm and back again. I took jobs all over the valley, from Scottsdale to Tempe to Mesa and beyond. Every time I parked my truck, I thought about Sharon's outraged face when I'd refused to move. It made me smile. I stayed in touch with the group of neighbors and contractors who'd fought the HOA together. We'd formed a bond through shared adversity, and even though the legal battle was over, the friendships remained. We'd get together occasionally for barbecues or drinks, swapping stories and catching up on life. Teresa Kim and the new HOA board did actually follow through on their promises to be better neighbors. They stopped harassing non-members, focused their enforcement efforts only within their actual jurisdiction, and even reached out to contractors to establish better relationships. It was a remarkable turnaround, proof that institutions could change if the right people were in charge and if there was sufficient pressure to reform. I framed the settlement agreement and hung it in my office. It was a reminder of what I'd fought for and won. My employees asked about it sometimes, and I'd tell them the story. Most of them were amazed that an HOA had tried to fine me for parking on a public street. It did sound absurd when you said it out loud, which was exactly why it had been worth fighting. The criminal restitution payments came through slowly, over several months as Sharon and Richard worked out payment plans with the court. Every check that arrived felt like a small victory, another confirmation that justice had been served. I distributed the money to the contractors who'd been scammed, making sure everyone got back what they'd lost plus their share of the damages. One afternoon, about 2 years after the whole thing started, I was working on an installation at a house in Gilbert, another Phoenix suburb. The homeowner, an older gentleman named Frank, mentioned that he was on his HOA board. I tensed slightly, old reflexes kicking in. "Don't worry," Frank said with a laugh, noticing my reaction. "I read about what happened with you and Sunrise Valley Estates. That was a hell of a thing. Our board uses it as a cautionary tale now. We make sure everyone understands the limits of our authority." "That's good to hear," I said. "HOAs get a bad rap, and honestly, a lot of times we deserve it," Frank continued. "But when they're run properly, they can actually help a community. The problem is when people let power go to their heads. That Whitmore woman, she just couldn't accept that there were limits to what she could control." He was right. That was the heart of it. Sharon Whitmore had convinced herself that being HOA president gave her authority over everyone and everything in her vicinity. She'd crossed legal and ethical lines, and when challenged, she doubled down rather than admitting she was wrong. That arrogance had been her downfall. My phone rang while I was finishing up Frank's installation. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. "Ingram Climate Solutions, this is Oliver." "Mr. Ingram, my name is Jessica Torres. I'm a contractor working in Chandler, and I'm having trouble with an HOA trying to fine me for parking on a public street. Someone told me you might be able to help." I smiled. This wasn't the first call like this I'd gotten, and it probably wouldn't be the last. "Tell me what's going on," I said, pulling out my notebook. I listened to her story, which sounded depressingly familiar, and gave her David Chen's contact information. I also talked her through the documentation process and explained her rights. "Don't let them bully you," I told her. "You're not doing anything wrong. They're the ones who are out of line." "Thank you," Jessica said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. I was starting to think I was crazy, like maybe I was wrong and they did have the right to fine me. "You're not crazy," I assured her. "They're counting on people not knowing their rights. Don't pay the fine. Get a lawyer if you need to, and document everything." After I hung up, I thought about how many other contractors, delivery drivers, and service workers were probably dealing with similar harassment from overreaching HOAs across Arizona and the rest of the country. My case had gotten media attention, but it was just one example of a much broader problem. I decided to do something about it. I worked with David to create a simple guide for contractors dealing with HOA harassment. It outlined your rights, explained how to document interactions, and provided basic legal information about parking on public streets and conducting business. I made it available for free on my company website and shared it with contractor associations throughout Arizona. The response was overwhelming. I got emails and calls from contractors across the state thanking me for the resource. Several people shared their own horror stories about HOAs. A few mentioned that they'd used the guide to successfully push back against bogus fines or restrictions. Local news stations picked up on the guide, doing follow-up stories about HOA overreach and how contractors could protect themselves. I did several interviews, always emphasizing the same points. Know your rights, don't be intimidated, and document everything. The coverage helped spread the message even further. The Arizona Contractors Association invited me to speak at their annual conference. I accepted and gave a presentation about my experience with Sunrise Valley Estates and the lessons I'd learned. The room was packed, standing room only, with contractors eager to hear about how to deal with difficult HOAs. During the queue and a session after my presentation, a woman raised her hand. "What would you say to someone who's thinking about just paying a bogus fine to avoid the hassle?" "I'd say I understand the temptation," I replied honestly. "Fighting takes time, energy, and sometimes money. But when you pay a fine you don't owe, you're not just hurting yourself. You're encouraging the HOA to keep doing it to other people. You're validating their overreach." Sometimes the right thing is also the hard thing. The room burst into applause, and I felt a surge of emotion. These were my people, hard-working contractors who just wanted to do their jobs without being harassed by petty tyrants. If my experience could help them stand up for themselves, then all the stress and frustration had been worth it. As time went on, the story of my battle with Sharon Whitmore and the Sunrise Valley Estates HOA became almost legendary in Phoenix contractor circles. New people entering the trades would hear about it, usually with some details embellished or exaggerated. I didn't mind. If it meant fewer contractors would get pushed around by out-of-control HOAs, then I was happy to be the cautionary tale. I never did run into Sharon Whitmore again after her sentencing. I heard through the grapevine that she'd moved out of Arizona entirely after serving her time, starting over somewhere else. Richard Patterson stayed in the Phoenix area but kept a low profile. I didn't wish them ill exactly, but I didn't feel sorry for them either. They'd made choices, broken laws, and faced consequences. The Sunrise Valley Estates HOA, under new leadership, actually became one of the more reasonable HOAs in the area. Teresa Kim served as president for 3 years, implementing reforms and rebuilding the association's reputation. They focused on actual community improvement rather than enforcement and harassment. Property values in the neighborhood actually increased, disproving Sharon's theory that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain home prices. My business continued to thrive. I bought a building to serve as a proper headquarters, with office space and a warehouse for parts and equipment. I employed 23 people at that point, including office staff, technicians, and apprentices. Every one of them knew the story of the HOA battle, and it became part of our company culture. We didn't back down from bullies. We did quality work, we followed the law, and we stood up for ourselves and our clients. I married a wonderful woman named Alina 3 years after the whole HOA incident. She'd heard about my story before we even met and thought it was hilarious. "You fought an HOA and won," she said on our 3rd date. "That's like beating up the neighborhood bully. Very attractive. We bought a house in Phoenix, and you better believe it wasn't in an HOA. I'd had enough of those to last a lifetime. We had a nice place with a big yard, space to park my trucks, and no covenants, conditions, or restrictions telling us what we could or couldn't do with our own property. Sometimes I'd drive past Sunrise Valley Estates for work, and the whole thing would feel surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But then I'd see my truck in the mirror, with the company logo, and I'd remember every detail. The confrontation with Sharon, the bogus fines, the legal battles, the eventual victory. It had been real, and it had mattered. I kept the orange violation sticker that Sharon had put on my truck, the one claiming my vehicle was subject to towing. It was in a drawer in my office, a reminder of where it all started. Every once in a while, I'd take it out and look at it, marveling at the audacity it represented. Someone had actually thought they could stick that on my truck, and I'd just comply. The broader conversation about HOA reform in Arizona did lead to some legislative changes. The state passed new laws requiring clearer disclosures about HOA authority limits, establishing better processes for disputing fines, and increasing penalties for HOAs that exceeded their jurisdiction. I'd like to think my case helped inspire those changes, even if it was just one small piece of a larger puzzle. David Chen and I remained friends long after the legal case was closed. We'd get lunch every few months, talking about business, life, and occasional legal issues that came up. He'd moved on to other cases, but he still remembered the HOA battle fondly. "One of my favorites," he'd say. "Clear-cut right and wrong, satisfying resolution, actual change came from it. That's the kind of case that reminds you why you went to law school." I attended a few more Sunrise Valley Estates HOA meetings over the years, just to observe and make sure they were staying on track with their reforms. I was always welcomed, though my presence was a bit awkward at first. Eventually, I became just another face in the crowd, someone who'd been part of the community's history but wasn't defined by it anymore. Zara Anderson sold her house a few years later and moved to a different part of Phoenix. We stayed in touch, though, and she'd occasionally hire my company for HVAC work at her new place. "Remember when we took down that awful HOA?" she'd say, laughing. "That was something. It really was something. A small group of regular people had stood up to institutional overreach and won. We'd faced down threats, intimidation, and bogus legal claims, and we'd come out the other side vindicated. Not everyone gets that kind of resolution in life. Not every bully faces consequences. But in this case, justice had prevailed. My trucks still say Ingram Climate Solutions on the side. I still park them wherever it's legal and convenient. I still take jobs throughout Phoenix and the surrounding areas. And if I see someone being hassled by an HOA for no good reason, I speak up. I share my story. I offer advice and support. Because if my experience taught me anything, it's that standing up for yourself matters, not just for you, but for everyone who comes after you. The whole saga, from that first confrontation with Sharon Whitmore to the final settlement and criminal convictions, took about 3 years from start to finish. 3 years of stress, documentation, legal battles, and public attention. But at the end of it, things had changed. An out-of-control HOA had been reined in. People who'd been scammed got their money back. Laws were changed to protect others from similar abuse, and I got to keep parking my truck wherever I needed to park it. On quiet days when I'm driving between jobs, I sometimes think about what would have happened if I just moved my truck that first day. If I'd let Sharon intimidate me, paid the bogus fine, and avoided that area going forward. It would have been easier in the short term, no question. But it would have been wrong, and every other contractor who came after me would have faced the same harassment, the same bogus fines, the same abuse of power. Instead, I fought back. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always fun, but it was right. And in the end, right prevailed. Sharon Whitmore learned that being HOA president didn't put her above the law. The Sunrise Valley Estates, HOA learned that they had boundaries they couldn't cross. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand your ground when you know you're right. I still work in Phoenix, still install and repair HVAC systems, still drive my company truck with pride. And if another HOA ever tries to tell me I can't park on a public street while doing my job, well, I've got the experience, the legal documents, and the confidence to tell them exactly where they can stick their bogus fines. I'm not in their HOA, and I'll park wherever I want, wherever it's legal, just like any other citizen has the right to do. That's the whole story. That's how one contractor stood up to an overreaching HOA and won. It's not the most dramatic tale in the world, but it's real, it mattered, and it changed things for the better. And sometimes, that's enough.